In May 1943, when the first German prisoners of war from the Afrika Korps arrived in the United States, they expected to find a country ravaged by war, as Nazi propaganda had promised. Instead, they were confronted with a reality that would completely destroy their beliefs about decadent America. May 1943, Camp Crossville, Tennessee. The wooden doors of the mess hall swing open, and for the first time since their capture in North Africa, German prisoners of war step into an American military dining facility. What happens next will shatter everything they believed about the war, about America, and about their chances of victory. The men shuffle forward in a ragged line, still wearing the dust-stained remnants of their Afrika Korps uniforms. They've been traveling for weeks, first across the Mediterranean in cramped transport ships, then across the Atlantic, and finally by train through the American heartland. They're exhausted, hungry, and deeply uncertain about what awaits them. Nazi propaganda had promised them that America was a weak nation, crippled by economic depression, torn apart by racial strife, barely capable of feeding its own people. They expected prison camps with minimal rations, perhaps even starvation. They were soldiers of the Third Reich, after all, and they'd been taught that captured enemies deserved little mercy. But as they approach the serving line, something doesn't match their expectations. The smell hits them first. Not the thin, watery soup they'd grown accustomed to in the desert. Not the stale hardtack that had sustained them through the final desperate weeks before surrender. This is the smell of real food. Fresh bread, roasted meat. Coffee, actual coffee. Not the ersatz chicory substitute they'd been drinking for months. One young soldier, barely 20 years old, stops in his tracks. His eyes widen as he stares at the serving trays ahead. An American soldier in a clean uniform stands behind the counter, looking almost bored as he ladles food onto metal trays. The German prisoner watches as the man in front of him receives his portion, a thick slice of roast beef, easily 6 ounces, mashed potatoes with a pat of real butter melting on top, green beans, carrots, 2 slices of white bread, not the dense, dark bread mixed with sawdust that German civilians had been eating, but soft, pure white bread, a cup of fresh milk, and on a separate plate a slice of apple pie. The young German turns to his comrade behind him and whispers in German, "Wir sind am Arsch. We are fucked." The phrase ripples through the line like an electric current. Other prisoners see what he sees, and the same realization crashes over them like a wave. This isn't just a meal. This is a message. This is proof that everything they'd been told was a lie. They'd been fighting a nation that could afford to feed its prisoners of war better than Germany could feed its own soldiers. To understand the magnitude of this shock, we need to go back several weeks, to the moment of their capture in North Africa. The Afrika Korps, once the pride of the Wehrmacht under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, had been steadily pushed back by Allied forces throughout 1942 and early 1943. By May 1943, the situation had become desperate. Supply lines from Europe had been cut by Allied naval and air superiority. The soldiers were receiving perhaps 1,200 calories a day, barely enough to sustain basic functions, let alone fight a war. Their rations consisted of hardtack biscuits, thin soup made from whatever vegetables could be scrounged, canned meat that was often spoiled in the desert heat, and ersatz coffee made from roasted grain. When the final surrender came, many of these men were genuinely relieved. They were starving, exhausted, and demoralized. But they still carried with them the propaganda they'd been fed for years. Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda had painted America as a nation in decline, a country where unemployment was rampant, where racial tensions threatened to tear society apart, where industrial capacity had been crippled by the Great Depression. German soldiers had been told that American troops were soft, poorly trained, and equipped with inferior weapons. They'd been assured that the United States could never match Germany's military might. The journey to America began to chip away at these beliefs. Those who were transported through Allied-controlled ports saw cities that were intact, bustling with activity, showing no signs of the devastation that war had brought to Europe. When they boarded ships bound for the United States, they noticed that even the transport vessels seemed well supplied. The Allied sailors weren't starving. They weren't desperate. They moved with the casual confidence of men who knew they were winning. But it was the train journey across America that truly began to break through the propaganda. The prisoners were transported in railway cars with windows, and as they traveled from the East Coast toward camps in the interior, they could see the American landscape rolling past. What they saw contradicted everything they'd been told. Farms stretched to the horizon, fields bursting with crops. Cattle grazed in vast pastures. Small towns appeared prosperous, their main streets lined with shops and automobiles. There were no bomb craters, no destroyed buildings, no signs of the economic collapse they'd been promised. This was a nation untouched by war, its industrial heartland operating at full capacity, its people well-fed and confident. Some of the prisoners began to feel the first stirrings of doubt, but many still clung to their beliefs. Perhaps this was just a facade, they told themselves. Perhaps the Americans were showing them only the prosperous areas, hiding the poverty and destruction. Perhaps the real America was different from what they were being shown. Then came the first meal. At Camp Crossville and dozens of other POW camps across the United States, German prisoners experienced the same shock. The United States military, following the guidelines of the 1929 Geneva Convention, provided prisoners of war with rations equivalent to those given to American soldiers. This wasn't an act of extraordinary generosity. It was simply following international law. But the effect on the German prisoners was profound. The daily caloric intake for POWs in American camps was approximately 3,000 calories. Some camps provided even more, particularly for prisoners assigned to work details. Compare this to the 1,200 to 1,500 calories these men had been receiving in North Africa, or the increasingly meager rations that German civilians were receiving back home. By 1943, German civilian rations had been cut to around 2,000 calories per day, and they would continue to decline as the war progressed. By 1945, many German civilians were surviving on fewer than 1,000 calories daily. But it wasn't just the quantity of food that shocked the prisoners. It was the quality and variety. At Camp Crossville specifically, breakfast was a revelation. Former prisoners later recalled meals that included scrambled eggs, real eggs, not powdered substitutes, bacon strips that were crispy and flavorful, fresh orange juice, cereals with milk, and pancakes soaked in genuine maple syrup. Maple syrup. Many of these men had never tasted maple syrup in their lives. It was a luxury item that simply didn't exist in wartime Germany. And here it was being poured liberally over stacks of fluffy pancakes for prisoners of war. Lunch might include hearty soup, sandwiches made with fresh meat and vegetables, fruit that was actually fresh, apples, oranges, bananas, and cookies or other baked goods. Dinner typically featured a substantial portion of meat, whether beef, pork, or chicken, along with potatoes prepared in various ways, multiple vegetables, bread with butter, and dessert. The desserts alone were mind-boggling. Pies, cakes, puddings, and occasionally ice cream. Ice cream, Coca-Cola. These weren't just foods. They were symbols of a consumer culture that most German soldiers had never experienced. Many had never tasted ice cream before. Coca-Cola was virtually unknown in Germany. These were luxury items, the kind of things that even wealthy Germans might have difficulty obtaining during wartime. And here they were, being served to prisoners of war. The psychological impact cannot be overstated. These men sat in mess halls, eating food that was better than what they'd received as soldiers in the Wehrmacht, better than what their families were eating back home, and they had to confront an uncomfortable truth. They were on the losing side of a war against a nation with seemingly unlimited resources. One prisoner later recalled the silence that fell over the mess hall during that first meal. Men ate slowly, almost reverently, savoring flavors they hadn't experienced in months or years. Some wept quietly. Others simply stared at their trays in disbelief. A few couldn't bring themselves to eat, overwhelmed by the cognitive dissonance between what they were experiencing and what they'd been taught to believe. As the days and weeks passed, the abundance continued. 3 full meals every day, without fail. The food was well prepared, nutritious, and plentiful. Prisoners who had been gaunt and malnourished began to fill out. Their health improved dramatically. Medical records from POW camps document the physical transformation. On average, German prisoners of war gained approximately 25 pounds during their captivity in the United States. Some gained significantly more. Historical documents from the American Re-Education Program, Note that many prisoners gained so much weight that they could no longer button the pants of their German uniforms. This physical transformation became a visible symbol of the disparity between American abundance and German scarcity. This weight gain became a source of both relief and guilt. The prisoners were grateful to be healthy again, to feel strong, to have energy, but many struggled with the knowledge that their families back home were suffering. Letters from Germany when they arrived spoke of increasing hardship. Food shortages were becoming severe. Bombing raids were destroying cities. The war was going badly, and here they were, prisoners in an enemy country eating better than they ever had in their lives. The camp authorities allowed prisoners to write letters home, though these were censored. Prisoners tried to tell their families about the conditions, about the food, about the treatment they were receiving. Censors often removed these references, fearing that such information might be used for propaganda purposes. But some letters got through, and the recipients in Germany could hardly believe what they read. Their sons, husbands, and brothers were writing about eating fresh meat, drinking real coffee, receiving medical care, even playing sports and attending educational classes. It seemed impossible. It seemed like a cruel joke, but it was true. Life in American POW camps was, for many prisoners, better than life had been in the Wehrmacht. Beyond the food, prisoners had access to recreational facilities. They could play soccer, volleyball, and other sports. At Camp Crossville, prisoners organized tennis and soccer leagues. They played cards in their free time. They could even purchase beer with the monthly allowance they received. Lieutenants earned $20 per month, which they could use to buy cigarettes, books, and other items from the Sears catalog. The Sears catalog. German prisoners of war were ordering consumer goods from an American mail-order catalog, while their countrymen back home were struggling to find basic necessities. They could attend classes, learning English or other subjects. Some camps offered educational programs taught by fellow prisoners who had been teachers or professors in civilian life. At Camp Crossville, prisoners could take piano lessons. They could participate in theatrical productions, musical performances, and art projects. Some camps had libraries stocked with books in German. Prisoners could form their own internal governance structures, electing representatives to communicate with camp authorities. This wasn't to say that life in the camps was luxurious or that prisoners were entirely happy. They were still prisoners, separated from their families, uncertain about the future, living behind barbed wire. Some camps were better than others. Some camp commanders were more humane than others. There were instances of mistreatment, of guards who were harsh or cruel, but overall the treatment of German POWs in the United States was remarkably good, especially when compared to the treatment of prisoners in other theaters of the war. Many prisoners were assigned to work details, and this brought them into even closer contact with American abundance. They worked on farms, helping to harvest crops. They worked in factories, supporting the war effort. They worked on construction projects, building roads and infrastructure. And through this work, they saw even more evidence of American industrial and agricultural capacity. Farmers who employed POW labor often treated them well. Some farmers' wives would bake pies or cakes for the prisoners. Farmers would sometimes share meals with them, inviting them to sit at the family table. This personal contact humanized the enemy in ways that propaganda never could. The prisoners met German Americans who had immigrated years earlier and who spoke German fluently. They met Americans who were kind, generous, and curious about Germany. They began to see Americans not as faceless enemies, but as individuals. One particularly striking aspect of the POW experience was the holiday celebrations. Thanksgiving and Christmas meals at the camps were extraordinarily generous. Turkey with all the trimmings, multiple side dishes, pies, cakes, and special treats. The American military went out of its way to make these holidays special, even for enemy prisoners. This generosity was partly strategic. Well-treated prisoners were less likely to cause trouble, more likely to cooperate, and might even provide useful intelligence. But it was also a reflection of American values and the belief that even enemies deserved humane treatment. And through all of this, the food kept coming. 3 meals a day, every day, without fail. The prisoners' bodies recovered from the malnutrition and stress of combat. Their minds began to process what they were experiencing, and slowly, for many of them, their worldview began to shift. The propaganda had told them that Germany was fighting for survival against inferior enemies. But how could America be inferior when it could feed millions of soldiers, support its allies, maintain its civilian population, and still provide abundant food to prisoners of war? The propaganda had told them that Germany's industrial might was unmatched. But how could that be true when America was producing ships, planes, tanks, and weapons at a rate that dwarfed German production, while simultaneously producing enough food to feed the world? The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. Some prisoners clung to their Nazi beliefs, insisting that this was all a trick, that Germany would still win, that the Führer had a secret plan. But many others began to question. They began to wonder if they'd been lied to. They began to consider the possibility that they'd been fighting for the wrong side. The United States military recognized this opportunity. Re-education programs were established in some camps, designed to introduce prisoners to democratic values and to counter Nazi propaganda. These programs were voluntary, and their effectiveness varied. Some prisoners embraced the ideas enthusiastically. Others rejected them outright. But even for those who resisted formal re-education, the simple experience of living in America, of seeing how the country functioned, of interacting with Americans, had an impact. The contrast with conditions in Germany became more stark as the war progressed. By 1944, German cities were being systematically destroyed by Allied bombing. Civilian casualties were mounting. Food shortages were becoming critical. The Nazi government was scraping the bottom of the barrel, conscripting old men and young boys to fight a war that was clearly lost. And in American POW camps, German soldiers were eating roast beef and apple pie. Some prisoners requested that their rations be reduced. They felt guilty eating so well while their families starved. Camp authorities generally refused these requests, citing the Geneva Convention requirements. But the guilt remained, a constant reminder of the war's toll on the German home front. The food situation in Germany had become truly desperate by the final year of the war. The Allied bombing campaign had disrupted transportation networks, making it difficult to distribute what food was available. Agricultural production had declined as farmers were conscripted into military service, and as fertilizer and fuel became scarce. The Nazi government had prioritized military needs over civilian welfare, and the result was widespread hunger. Urban populations suffered the most, as they had no access to gardens or farms where they might supplement their rations. Meanwhile, in American POW camps, the abundance continued unabated. The United States had become what President Franklin Roosevelt called the arsenal of democracy, and its agricultural sector was equally impressive. American farms were producing record harvests, feeding not only the American population and military, but also providing food aid to allied nations through programs like Lend-Lease. The country's industrial and agricultural capacity seemed limitless, and German prisoners witnessed this firsthand. When the war finally ended in May 1945, the prisoners faced an uncertain future. Repatriation was a slow process. Some prisoners remained in American camps until 1946. During this time, they received news of Germany's total defeat, of the occupation by Allied forces, of the discovery of concentration camps, and the full extent of Nazi atrocities. For many prisoners, this was the final blow to any remaining loyalty to the Nazi regime. They had fought for a government that had committed unspeakable crimes, and they had lost to a nation that had treated them with relative humanity. The discovery of the concentration camps was particularly devastating for many POWs. Some had known about the camps, or at least suspected their existence. Others claimed complete ignorance. But when confronted with photographic evidence and testimony from survivors, they could no longer deny the reality of what had been done in their name. The cognitive dissonance between the humane treatment they'd received in American camps and the horrific treatment that Jews, political prisoners, and others had received in Nazi camps was overwhelming. The return to Germany was a shock in the opposite direction. Prisoners who had spent years eating well, gaining weight, and living in relative comfort now returned to a country in ruins. Cities were destroyed. Infrastructure was shattered. Millions were homeless. Food was scarce. The contrast with America was overwhelming. Germany, which had claimed to be building a 1,000-year Reich, had been reduced to rubble in just 12 years. America, which Nazi propaganda had dismissed as weak and decadent, stood as the most powerful nation on earth. The repatriation process itself highlighted the differences between the two nations. Former POWs were processed through camps in Europe before being sent home. Some spent time in French POW camps, where conditions were much harsher than what they'd experienced in America. Food was scarce, accommodations were overcrowded, and treatment was rough. The French, who had suffered under German occupation, were less inclined to be generous to their former enemies. This made the American treatment seem even more remarkable in retrospect. When the former POWs finally reached Germany, they found a population that was struggling to survive. The immediate post-war period, particularly the winter of 1945-1946, was one of extreme hardship. Food rations for German civilians had dropped to starvation levels. The infrastructure for distributing food had been destroyed. The currency was worthless. People were reduced to bartering and scavenging. Former soldiers returning from American POW camps, healthy and well-fed, stood in stark contrast to the malnourished civilians they encountered. Many former POWs became advocates for democracy and for rebuilding Germany along democratic lines. They had seen firsthand that democracy could work, that it could create prosperity and abundance. They had experienced the difference between a society based on freedom and one based on totalitarian control. Their experiences in American POW camps, including those first shocking meals, had changed them fundamentally. Some former POWs maintained contact with Americans they'd met during their captivity. Some even returned to the United States to visit the camps where they'd been held, or to reconnect with farmers they'd worked for, or guards they'd befriended. A few chose to immigrate to America permanently, seeking opportunities in the land that had once been their enemy. These personal connections helped to build bridges between the two nations during the post-war period. The story of German POWs and American food abundance is more than just an interesting historical footnote. It's a story about the power of soft power, about how treating enemies with humanity can be more effective than treating them with cruelty. It's a story about the importance of industrial and agricultural capacity in modern warfare. It's a story about the lies that governments tell their people and the truth that eventually breaks through. When those young German soldiers stood in that Chow line in May 1943, staring at trays piled high with food, they experienced a moment of clarity. The whispered phrase, "Wir sind am Arsch," captured a profound realization. They weren't just fucked because they'd been captured. They were fucked because they'd been fighting a war they could never win, against an enemy whose resources were so vast that it could afford to feed its prisoners better than Germany could feed its own soldiers. The abundance of food in American POW camps was a weapon more powerful than any bomb or bullet. It demonstrated, in the most visceral way possible, the futility of Germany's war effort. You cannot defeat a nation that has so much that it can afford to be generous, even to its enemies. You cannot win a war of attrition against a country that can produce food, weapons, and supplies in seemingly unlimited quantities while barely straining its economy. The German prisoners who experienced this abundance carried the memory with them for the rest of their lives. Many returned to Germany and helped rebuild it as a democratic nation, allied with the United States. They told their children and grandchildren about their experiences, about the shock of that first American meal, about the realization that they'd been lied to by their government. Their stories became part of the complex narrative of World War II, a reminder that wars are not just fought on battlefields, but in the hearts and minds of soldiers and civilians. Today, the treatment of prisoners of war remains a critical issue in international law and military ethics. The Geneva Conventions, which guided the treatment of POWs during World War II, continue to set standards for how captured enemies should be treated. The American experience with German POWs during World War II stands as an example of how following these standards can serve not just humanitarian purposes, but strategic ones as well. Treating prisoners humanely can undermine enemy morale, can facilitate intelligence gathering, and can lay the groundwork for post-war reconciliation. The story also serves as a reminder of the importance of truth in wartime. Nazi propaganda had created a false image of America, and when German soldiers encountered the reality, the propaganda collapsed. In an age of information, warfare, and competing narratives, the lesson remains relevant. Lies may work in the short term, but truth has a way of breaking through, especially when people can see and experience it for themselves. That first meal in the Chow line at Camp Crossville, and camps like it across America, was more than just food. It was a revelation, a turning point, a moment when the scales fell from the eyes of young men who had been taught to hate and fear America. They learned that their enemy was not the monster they'd been told about. They learned that abundance and generosity could coexist with military strength. They learned that they'd been on the wrong side of history. And it all started with a tray of food: roast beef, mashed potatoes, green beans, white bread, milk, and apple pie. Simple, ordinary American food that, to starving German soldiers, looked like a feast fit for kings and tasted like the bitter truth of defeat.